About 30 miles north of Salt Lake City, Utah, there's a big U.S. military installation called Hill Air Force Base. Hill Air Force Base is indeed in a lovely and very mountainous part of northern Utah. But that is not how it got its name. Hill Air Force Base is actually named after a guy named Hill. Ployer Peter Hill, a U.S. Army test pilot who died in really dramatic circumstances while flying test flights in a new plane that the Army was considering buying at the time. In the 1930s, the Army Air Corps wanted a big new bomber to add to its fleet. And Boeing designed one to try to get that contract. Boeing was almost kaput as a company at that point. They basically bet the whole future of their company on trying to win this Army Air Corps contract. And what they built was a whole new approach to military aircraft. Instead of 2 engines, it had 4. It was huge. Its wingspan was more than 100 feet wide. It could fly faster than previous bombers. It could fly further than previous bombers. It could hold tons more bombs than the Army had ever been able to put in a plane like this before. But on October 30th, 1935, that plane, the Boeing Experimental Test Model number 299, the 299 had an ace test pilot named Ployer Peter Hill at the controls. It was being evaluated by the Army to see if they were going to invest in this huge, amazing new plane that could do so much more than any other bomber ever had before. And in that test, the plane crashed. It took off, it got its nose up way too high, basically went straight up, then it cartwheeled over onto one side, came down on one wing, exploded into flames. Ployer Peter Hill, the chief of flight testing in the U.S. Army Air Corps, he was piloting that plane. He was killed instantly. The Army awarded the initial contract for their new bomber to a competing aircraft from a different company. The Army assigned a board of officers to figure out what happened in this deadly crash, to find out what was wrong with their super promising plane that they'd been so excited about before it crashed in this test flight. Turned out there was nothing wrong with the plane. It was human error. A thing was locked at takeoff that was supposed to be unlocked at takeoff, and that was enough to make it go straight up before it came straight down. That was enough to crash the Model 299. A doctor and writer named Atul Gawande wrote about this for the New Yorker magazine a few years ago because that diagnosis of that plane crash, that diagnosis that this incredibly good, incredibly experienced, incredibly expert pilot was responsible for that crash. It wasn't the plane's fault, it was the pilot's fault. That diagnosis led to a really important cure. Convinced that this Boeing bomber was still the right plane for the U.S. military, after that crash, a group of test pilots got together. The plane had crashed, the contract had been given to another company, but they still wanted that plane, and they wanted to try to figure out a way that the Army could still use this Boeing plane. And what they came up with was deceptively simple. It was a checklist. A point-by-point pilot's checklist for taxiing in that plane, taking off in that plane, flying that plane, and landing that plane. So yes, this Boeing Model 299 was more complicated than other planes had been before that point. But if you didn't just depend on the expert pilot memorizing everything and doing everything perfect every time in this complicated plane, if instead you broke it down and you wrote everything down that needed doing, and you made someone in the cockpit overtly check off every step in the cockpit every time those things needed to be done, well then, maybe it was flyable. Maybe the Army Air Corps could have this plane with all of this capability that they wanted so bad. Well, that plane went on to be the B-17 bomber, which was, frankly, a really big help in bombing the snot out of the Nazis in World War II, thank you very much. And yes, the B-17 and its prototypes, they were more complicated than planes had been before. But with this pilot's checklist innovation, pilots flying after Ployer Peter Hill went on to fly that Boeing plane nearly 2 million miles without having another accident. And to this day, one of the things pilots carry around in those giant, oversized, boxy suitcases they always have with them in the cockpit is their cockpit checklist. And it seems like a dumb thing, but even when you are an expert, even when you're highly trained and you've done it a million times and you know what to do, turns out the simple fact of having someone check with you overtly that you have taken every step you need to take, it can make all the difference. It can make the difference between you just being an expert and you being the kind of expert who performs basically flawlessly in an environment that cannot tolerate mistakes. And the reason that story of the B-17 bomber and employer Peter Hill has become something that doctors write about in popular magazines is because that idea, that deceptively simple idea of the pilot's checklist, that's the same basic idea that led to checklists being used by doctors. There's now a famous study from Johns Hopkins Hospital about a decade ago in which intensive care unit nurses at Johns Hopkins were told to follow a checklist. Fill out a checklist every time doctors put in a central line catheter, which is a big catheter that goes into the neck. And nurses were told to use the checklist to make sure that doctors followed all the steps they needed to follow to keep the patient from getting an infection when they were getting a line inserted in their neck. And, you know, this kind of stuff, I wouldn't want to do it, but to a doctor, it's not rocket science. This stuff that they needed to do wasn't the toughest thing they do, but at Johns Hopkins, they nevertheless decided to put all the steps on a checklist. Number 1, wash hands with soap, check. Number 2, clean the patient's skin with antiseptic, check. Number 3, put sterile drapes over the patient's whole body, check, and so on, and so on. And then look at this, look what the checklist did. The unit that made this change monitored the results in their patients for a year after they started this checklist system. Quote, the results were so dramatic that they weren't sure whether to believe them. The 10-day line infection rate went from 11% to 0. So then they followed their patients for 15 more months. Only 2 line infections occurred during the entire period. They calculated that in this one hospital, just this checklist had prevented 43 infections and 8 deaths. And it had saved $2 million in costs just in that one hospital. Just putting what they already knew they should do on a written checklist as a way of making sure they actually did it. Just like flying the B-17, right? In both cases, the people whose behavior is being improved, perfected by the checklist, they're already really high-performing, highly trained people. I mean, military pilots, test pilots, intensive care doctors working at one of the best hospitals in the country, probably one of the best hospitals in the world. These are not idiots, right? These people are at the top of their game. And what they're getting better at by using this system is not the hardest thing about their jobs. Washing your hands is not something you need years of medical school to learn to do, right? But that is the kind of stuff that it turns out it can easily go wrong. Doesn't mean that you're an idiot. You might be the most intensely trained expert person in the world in your field. But that kind of stuff can go wrong. We're human. And so there need to be ways, systemic ways, of stopping those kinds of small and simple but potentially fatal errors. A checklist works, turns out. Genius.